Welcome to today's webinar, High Quality Fermented Forage, Investigating Critical Control Points, presented by Dairy Herd Management and sponsored by Hansen Incorporated. I'm Dave Natsky, editor of Dairy Herd Management, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Joining us today are Dr. Bryan, Animal Health and Nutrition Technical Services Manager with Hansen Incorporated, and John Gazer, Director of Nutritional Research and Innovation with Rock River Laboratory Incorporated. After spending 20 years at Penn State University in the Department of Dairy and Animal Science, Dr. Bryan transitioned to the feed additive industry, focusing on silage inoculants and nutritional supplements and how they support production, health, and reproduction for improved performance and sustainable economic returns. As Technical Services Manager for Hansen Incorporated, Dr. Bryan's time is devoted to improving efficiency of nutrient preservation and utilization at critical control points through scientifically based and proven microbial technology. Dr. John Gazer grew up on his family's 1,000-cow dairy farm in eastern Wisconsin and studied agronomy, plant breeding, and dairy science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, eventually earning his PhD in dairy nutrition. In his current role as Rock River Laboratory's Director of Nutritional Research and Innovation, John offers nutritionists and consultants advice and expertise to complement lab analysis results and solve challenges in the field. He also continues research and teaching as an adjunct professor at UW-Madison. Welcome, gentlemen. We're going to start the discussion today on the topic of sustainability. Everyone seems to have their own definition of that word. Dr. Bryan, you talk about dairy sustainability cycle. Describe what you mean when you talk about sustainability and discuss how specialized new inoculant technologies fit into that definition.
Thank you, Dave. I think it's really important as we move forward in our discussion of sustainability that we adequately define what sustainability encompasses relative to the dairy industry. First and foremost, it hinges on animal performance, but it also includes significant role of animal health as well as societal impact on animal welfare, our environmental obligations relative to sustainability, as well as food safety aspects. More often than not, when we talk about sustainability, the vast majority of folks will touch on at least two, if not all five, of these key aspects of sustainability, but they'll leave out what I believe is the most critical in order to sustain any enterprise, especially dairy, and that's profitability. So without profitability, I know of no industry, including dairy, that is sustainable. And this is an overreaching theme as we move into our discussion of the ultimate end product, which is milk, and the reason we're in this business. Moving forward, our specific topic for today is high-quality fermented forage and investigating critical control points. Critical control points have been used in a variety of other industries, and I realize this slide may be just a little bit busy for some, but we're going to break it apart and look at its individual components and how we can identify critical control points and then utilize information gleaned from those control points to make sound decisions and improve efficiencies and hopefully profitability. It's important that we understand first and foremost that some folks refer to bottlenecks in an operation or in a continuum, and it's important to realize that every bottleneck is a critical control point, but conversely, not every critical control point has to be a bottleneck. So let's look at some of the components of the dairy sustainability cycle individually. First and foremost, we've got feed and forage. We take the time to identify particular crops that we're going to plant in particular fields for particular reasons. So we have this feed and forage inventory out in the field. And there's plenty of nutrients available there, and we utilize winter cover forage crops or even alfalfa, hay, or haylage, not simply for soil erosion control or as nurse crops, or to simply scavenge residual nitrogen. There are significant nutrients available that are harvestable, potentially stored, and then fed through dairy cows. So what are the goals? Obviously, we want as much total nutrient yield per acre as possible, but we need to be able to preserve those nutrients, potentially improve the nutritive value of those nutrients with some degree of control of the process moving from the field to the feed bunk. Those are the critical control points where we have significant opportunities to improve efficiency. So what are critical control points? What can we do? And will they ultimately improve our efficiency and return on investment? We can break these down into three key areas: the physical, chemical, and environmental aspects of getting feed and forage nutrients to the cow and through the cow. First and foremost, the physical aspects: maturity, moisture, particle size, and chop length. What can we do to implement critical controls that yield more milk per acre and improve our ultimate efficiency? Well, in terms of maturity and moisture, generally it's a balance between quantity of forage and quality of forage. As we look at maturity or increasing maturity, we increase our dry matter production, but we don't necessarily increase digestibility all the way to the seed stage. So there's an optimum in terms of maximizing dry matter productivity as well as digestibility of nutrients. Another physical aspect of forage includes losses. And we've heard estimates of dry matter loss in storage facilities versus dry matter loss in the field. And here's just a simple schematic that represents lots of data relative to storage losses in the red line and field losses on the black line. And when someone tells you that their dry matter loss is 7%, I think we should view that with a little bit of skepticism, because 7% across an ideal moisture range of 45 to 70% represents only the field loss. And you can simply double that in most instances to get at storage losses. So now we're upwards of 30% on average, or at least 25%, the combined field and storage losses before we ever get that forage dry matter in front of the cow. Next, we can focus on the chemical control points or influences. And when we talk about fermented forage, obviously terminal pH is of critical importance due to high lactic acid concentration, as well as minimal acetic, propionic, butyric acid content, and then minimizing losses of crude protein in the form of ammonia nitrogen and soluble sugars in the form of ethanol. In certain parts of the country, volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, are of critical concern, particularly in California with certain rules and laws regulating mitigating circumstances that need to be employed in order to reduce VOCs as they impact ozone production. From an environmental standpoint, at Christian Hansen, we're focusing our attention on clean forage, minimizing yeast and mold counts, minimizing the negative impact of Clostridia, as well as mycotoxins. We've investigated the importance of ash content, and I'm not going to go into any further detail at this point because I know Dr. Gazer will have a few observations and comments relative to ash. Also, relative to our nutrient scorecard, we analyze management factors that influence dry matter preservation, whether it's at the face of the bunker or pile, along the top layer, just under the plastic, and then what's done with discarded feed or that suboptimal feed that we find at the edges or along the top layer. Again, utilizing physical, chemical, and environmental influences or critical control points, we hope to be able to preserve more forage from field to feed bunk, as well as ultimately improved utilization and digestibility in the cow. So going back to the basis of the dairy sustainability cycle, what can we do from a critical control point to maximize nutritional feeding values and dry matter preservation of all the feed and forage nutrients that we've taken so much time, energy, and resources to plant, grow, and harvest? Obviously, we have an opportunity to use inoculants, microbial-based inoculants, to enhance this particular critical control point. One such inoculant is SiloSolve, SiloSolve MC in particular for microbial control, where we utilize highly researched strains of beneficial bacteria to drive the process in a favorable direction and hopefully minimize loss and deterioration. Our specific M74 Enterococcus faecium strain is a front-end fermenter that provides tremendous growth in a relatively short amount of time. As you can see in the upper left-hand panel, the E. faecium blue line reaches a log 9 concentration much quicker than some other strains. In the upper right-hand portion of the panel, the Lactobacillus plantarum, our specific strain CH6072 drives fermentation to a lower terminal pH compared to other strains. So we have strength at the front end and strength at the back end relative to the fermentation process. Also, coupled with those two foundation strains is a novel Lactococcus lactis, SR354, which has patented anti-clostridial properties. The ability of SR354 to significantly reduce Clostridia concentration is shown in the top center panel. There is approximately a 300-fold difference in Clostridia concentration between the untreated control and the forage that was treated with SR354. If we look at the SiloSolve MC performance in grass, you can see that lactic acid concentration is increased due to treatment with SiloSolve MC, with no significant change in acetic acid, whether it's a higher moisture grass in the left-hand panel or a slightly lower moisture grass in the right-hand panel. SiloSolve MC also preserves protein quantity and quality. As you can see, there's not much difference in crude protein on a dry matter percent in the two left-hand vertical bars, but there is considerably less ammonia in terms of percent total nitrogen in the SiloSolve MC treated forage. And again, MC was designed not only to preserve forage, but also to reduce Clostridia concentration. And I go back to similar numbers that we discussed a minute ago, and there's a 99% reduction in Clostridia concentration in the SR354 treated forage compared with the untreated control. Another important aspect of silage management and preservation revolves around the deteriorating top layer that's oftentimes highly infested with yeast and mold, is subject to a little bit of oxygen. We've all heard a lot in terms of oxygen barrier type plastics, but we've got a novel SiloSolve product that gives producers an alternative to the oxygen barrier plastics. And specifically, we rely on our two foundation strains, the Ephasium M74 and Lactobacillus plantarum CH6072, for rapid front end and very potent terminal pH capabilities. But to this we add Lactococcus lactis 0224, which has tremendous oxygen scavenging effect. Those three strains, combined with sodium benzoate and SiloSolve ES, have given us outstanding results in the field relative to managing top layer mold, yeast, and minimizing feed deterioration. In this slide, on the left-hand panel, you can see forage treated with SiloSolve OS has very little spoilage, very little deterioration, and when analyzed through laboratory, had less than 1,000 CFUs per gram of both mold and yeast. Conversely, the other half of this particular pile went untreated, and we found upon analysis that there were over 30 million CFUs per gram of mold and yeast. There was no oxygen barrier plastic used in this particular pile, simply 5 mil plastic over the top with tires for support. The other thing is that you notice very little mold, very little yeast, but also very little spoiled or rotten feed on the top layer of the left versus the top layer of the right. When we look across a fairly decent sized number of top layers that we studied in 2012, you can see that using a log 5 threshold, or 100,000 CFUs per gram for yeast and mold, untreated top layers were typically well over 1 million CFUs per gram of both yeast and mold. But the SiloSolve treated top layer was closer to 10,000 for yeast and 1,000 for mold, well below our log 5 threshold. So in terms of SiloSolve MC and SiloSolve OS, we believe we're bringing to the market novel inoculants to mitigate Clostridia, infiltration, and deleterious effects in forage, and also inhibiting yeast and mold in the top layer in terms of SiloSolve OS. And more often than not, we find that the discussion revolves around inoculants simply being an insurance policy to minimize nutrient loss, at which point most will see a 3-to-1 or possibly a 4-to-1 return on investment. But in terms of minimizing nutrient loss and potentially increasing nutritive value, we believe that inoculants have a return on investment that exceeds 7-to-1. And although not presented today, we are gathering data relative to a potential probiotic effect of inoculated forage in the cow, and we have a few studies that clearly confirm that certain inoculants on certain forages are capable of actually yielding more milk per cow compared with untreated or uninoculated forages. So with that, I'd like to move ahead and have Dr. Gazer present some of what he's found and what he's seeing in the field relative to forages. John?
Good afternoon or good morning. I appreciate you bringing me in and inviting me to present with your group today and offer a bit of what we're seeing and I'm seeing through Rock River Laboratory in quality of forages and then a little bit beyond forage quality, how well we're doing preserving our forages on an average basis. What we'll get into in the next 20 to 30 minutes of my session will be to look, I always enjoy reflecting back to what is the industry doing? What is our industry outlook? Having been a consultant in the field, I very much like to keep my feet on the ground and understand what's happening day to day on the dairy farm, from the field to the bulk tanks to profitability. We'll look through forage quality trends, mostly nutritive values. We'll discuss some opportunities to improve performance, and then we'll discuss, as Dr. Bryan alluded to before, what can we do to maintain our high-quality feed stuff that we preserve through a silo or a bunker or a pile or a pit or a bag. And we'll discuss what can happen through fermentation and then what we are seeing, again, on average, through Rock River Laboratory. Looking at industry trends, I enjoy referencing a group called CIH. I receive biweekly emails with a PDF update using futures prices of both milk and then inputs in soybeans and corn prices, and this group does an effort to speculate out into the next 4 quarters of the upcoming year what profitability will be like in the dairy sector and in the beef sector and in the swine and other agricultural industries. But what I'd like to point out on this slide that I've adapted from a CIH email, which I've referenced below, I'm excited that we're looking forward to hopefully very profitable quarters throughout the next year on the dairy side, speculating that margins will be 90 to 100th of a percentile relative to the last 5 to 10 years. So it's an exciting time to be in the dairy industry. Again, looks to be very profitable, but that doesn't mean that we should at all relax in pushing for improved performance, improved efficiencies. So I'd like to start with, when I speak about forage quality, there are multiple different areas that we can discuss forage quality or feed quality. It can either be out of the field, or it can be preserving through and feeding in front of the cattle. And what I've presented to you here is I've got a forage report that comes from Rock River Laboratory, and we present many different nutritive parameters on these forage analyses that are very important to your nutritional program and are important for computer model simulations and projections so that we can most efficiently maximize performance while maximizing return on investment, essentially looking at maximizing profitability. But in looking at the number of nutritional parameters, 10, 15, 20 that are listed on a forage report, I quickly focus on just several to get an idea of what sort of nutritive quality we have coming off of the field. I start with carbohydrates. I look to both fiber and starch levels of alfalfa or grass, hay, and haylage crops. I also look at the fiber level of corn silage as one of the first areas that I focus on to assess what sort of forage quality we are going to be dealing with. I also look at the starch content, being another carbohydrate, very different from fiber, but also a carbohydrate. So I look at starch content and corn silages. And then I reflect also back to the protein content of the haylage after focusing on the fiber. Again, what sort of protein value do we have to our feedstuff, grass or alfalfa haylage? Because protein at this point is a very costly nutrient to bring into our diet. And thirdly, more recently, I'm focusing and looking at ash content. And Dr. Bryan mentioned before that I've noticed some things coming through our laboratory over the past few years, which we'll highlight in a few slides from here. But I also look at ash content, ash being soil or sand or a component to our feed that has zero energy value, zero nutritional value. And I like to use the term anti-nutritional and can in fact bring some negative components. So while I first looked at carbohydrates and protein to assess forage quality, I also looked to feed digestibility, feedstuff, fiber and starch digestibility, because as we'll expand upon here in a minute, the energetic value of a pound or a ton of feed is a combination both of nutrient content and nutrient digestibility. Just because we have a 150 relative feed value haylage doesn't mean that there's going to be the same energy in that 150 relative feed value as opposed to feed that might be 150 but have a much higher fiber digestibility. That energetic value might be quite a bit higher. So we'll start by reviewing some past 5-year averages that we've seen through Rock River Laboratory. And the next two charts I'll present are going to look similar in layout. On the left-hand y-axis is going to be fiber content, and that's going to be presented as percent of dry matter. Then on the right-hand column, the secondary y-axis, that is either protein or ash content, also expressed as a percentage of dry matter. So as we look at trends over the last 5 years, and again I have forages grouped into the year that they were submitted to the laboratory, you don't see very strong trends in fiber content. I tend to look for less than 40% fiber. Again, looking at right in the middle of the graph, look at less than 40% fiber content, alfalfa silages. Grasses, I look for less than 45% NDF. But you can see on average, we don't have a clear trend on fiber content, meaning that we don't have a clear trend on quality year after year. Ideally, I would like to see the fiber content slightly in decline year after year, but you can see that's not the case. In 2012, we had much lower values than we did in 2013 and 2014 submitted samples. And as we get into the harvest year this year, again, I'm not entirely certain what to expect. Protein is going to be inversely related to fiber in most cases. Again, not much of a trend there. The one trend I have seen consistently, though, and I've noticed over the past 5 years, and you can see highlighted here with the red bar drawn across the graph, is we've noticed ash content increasing each year, year after year, in a linear fashion. What was less than an 8% ash content on average coming through the laboratory is now over 9% on average and approaching 10% ash content. Again, that's bringing in no energetic value and has potential to bring in mold, yeast, Clostridia, other soil-borne microorganisms that have, again, potentially negative interactions within diet and nutrition programs. Again, that graph was focusing on grasses and alfalfas. This graph here, similar layout, although it's looking at corn silages. Submitted the last 5 years, and again, these would be crops harvested in 2010 through 2014. And again, you can see similar lack of trend in both fiber content and starch content. When I look at, again, corn silage or alfalfa, hay or haylages or grass silages, again, I'm first looking at that fiber content with my threshold being about 40%. I would like to see somewhere in the 38 to 40% fiber content of alfalfa and corn silages, again, for more likely higher energy content. But again, you see there aren't clear trends here. From an alfalfa and a grass standpoint, when we look at managing, what can we do to improve the quality? Variety, genetics has some impact, but we have a much larger impact by managing through the field. Cutting based on crop physiology, cutting at bud stage as opposed to letting the plant bloom out, whereas on the corn silage side, it's a bit different of a management response, and genetics are much more of a factor on the corn silage side, with quality being influenced more so by genetics with corn silage quality as opposed to hay and haylage. So as I mentioned before, the resulting quality at the end of the year is a combination of both the nutritive content and nutrient digestibility. When, as a nutritionist, we put diets together for high-performing cattle, we formulate for specific levels of fiber and starch and other nutrient contents, but we also consider digestibility, because energy out of a ton of feed, again, is partly due to nutrient digestibility. And we need to take that into account with our nutrition platforms. So we can create a lower energy diet or a higher energy diet by reducing fiber and increasing starch or increasing grain, which we've known for years. But cattle, ruminants, have a physical need for fiber within the rumen. So we want to do what we can to optimize fiber content, but we don't want to dilute out too much of the higher energy feeds such as starch and sugars and other portions of the grain and protein. So it's a balancing act. And then we've recognized that digestibility of the fiber and starch also is quite a bit different among feedstuffs, among genetics, and different management factors. At the end of the day, you can see in the picture on the bottom right-hand corner, we want to maximize the nutritive value of all the feedstuffs we put in front of the animal by putting the right nutritional profile and then maximizing both fiber, starch, carbohydrate digestion, and optimizing rumen performance. This is the manure screening I've shown here, meaning washed out manure in a kitchen colander, and you can see quite a bit of grain, undigested grain, and some larger particles of fiber. This is an opportunity that shows us we could have gained maybe 10 or 15% better utilization of the grain, and that likely impacted the fiber digestibility as well. But this is a situation we do not want to see on farm. On this slide, carrying through then, again, we're going to focus on forages today, but looking at when we combine forages with grains, with protein mix, and put an entire TMR in front of a cattle, I'm going to show three different charts here, three different graphs, and what these are actual diet performance measurements. So at Rock River, we have a tool where we can measure actual diet digestibility from your cattle, total ration, and we can determine what the cattle used and what they didn't as far as a nutrient and digestibility level. This tool is called TMRD, but I'll show you some results, a combination of database results and some results published in a Journal of Dairy Science paper. And the first chart I have up is actually looking at total diet digestion. So if we feed an animal 100 pounds of feed, you can see, again, this is a population histogram, or just a breakdown of all the samples we've seen through the laboratory, and you can see where the colored mass peaks. That's where samples come in through the laboratory on average. And then you can see the higher end and the lower end of reports we get through. So what this chart is showing us is we have between 50 and 80% total diet digestion. That's where a majority of our samples come through. You can see that there are a few samples that are both below and above that threshold, but you can see a majority of the samples that come through our laboratory between 50 and 80%. I would speculate that many of these are put together and have a similar nutrient content, so they all might be, they're similar to maybe 30% fiber, 27% starch, but you can see wide variations in digestibility and TMR performance. And moving forward, speculating why is this? On this next slide, you can see fiber digestibility ranges from 30 to 50, almost 60%. Again, this is of the total diet. So again, hitting on the factor that digestibility is very important of our feedstuffs, and setting the stage for some information I'll show you in regards to forage quality. And moving beyond fiber and then looking to starch digestibility, you can see ranges of 85 to 100% digestibility. So again, of every bushel of corn we put in front of a cow, or every pound of TMR that we put in front of a high-performing cow, there's quite a bit of variation we've noticed in the field as to how much is actually digested. And for every unit improvement in diet digestibility, that corresponds to roughly a half pound of milk. Again, that came out of the paper published in Journal of Dairy Science. From fiber and starch digestibility, the possibility of 3 to 6 to 10 pounds of milk opportunity is there strictly through digestive characteristics. Again, similar fiber levels, potentially similar starch levels in the diet, but differences in digestibility. Now moving beyond the diet, and I want to introduce a concept called TT-NDSD that was developed by Professor Dave Combs at the University of Wisconsin. It's going to be the basis of which I will show several years data on forage fiber digestibility for both corn and alfalfa and grass crops. But I wanted to briefly introduce and comment that this tool combines several different pieces of information available for a forage report, combines that into a rumen model, and then predicts out forage fiber digestibility through an 85-pound cow. It's a very concrete tool, and it's been available now a number of years. I want to again reference the University of Wisconsin and Professor Combs, who put this together and have validated or are continuing to validate this. But it's a very simple tool in that it tells us how much fiber will a high-performing cow potentially use. The averages are very similar for hay, haylages, and corn silages, averaging around 43%, and the goal being 48% or higher. Again, 48% of fiber being digested by a high-performing cow. So moving beyond that introduction, now again we'll look back to 2011, 12, 13, and looking at forage quality. Again, the first factor I looked at in alfalfa, hay, and grass, hay and haylage, is going to be fiber level. You can see similar metrics here to what I presented before, but now we've added an additional option to the chart, looking at fiber digestibility, here specified as TT-NDSD. Again, in 2011, on the primary y-axis, again ranging from 39 to 49%, you can see we had quite above average forage quality in 2011 coming through Rock River Laboratory. And 2012 dipped off a fair bit. Long-term average on this fiber digestibility tool, again, is 43%. So you can see both in 2011 and 2012, TT-NDSD values were above average coming through the laboratory. But you can see in 2013 then, fiber digestibility of the feed actually dropped off substantially from 2012. To make matters worse, fiber content was also higher in 2013 feed, diluting out sugar, diluting out other higher quality nutrients such as protein, and again, decreasing the energy value of the feed in 2013, again on average. Moving forward to corn silage, and again, these two slides represent data that was published in popular press, but I want to again highlight the fact that fiber content, again, a similar layout to the previous slide, increased in 2013, and then more substantially, fiber digestibility on 2013 corn silage dropped off substantially to the tune of 10 to 15%. And I'm hearing many accounts from the field of cattle not performing, intakes being up, drop-offs in some efficiency, just opportunities for a bit better performance, and I'm speculating part of this may have to do with decreased fiber digestibility in 2013 corn silage. Again, so 2013 does not look like it's been an opportune year, despite the fact that we're setting up for hopefully great profitability in 2014. 2013 forages, on average, from the West Coast to the East Coast, digestibility has slightly dropped off. Starch quality, starch digestibility. As I mentioned before with the TMR example before, we've got quite a range in total track starch digestibility ranging from 80-85% up to 100%. What's interesting and unique about a ruminant is that starch can be digested actually in two places, within the rumen or actually in the intestines. So while total tract digestibility might range from 85 to 100%, seemingly not that large of a range for corn, ruminal starch digestibility can actually range from 45% upwards of 80 to 85%. Digesting corn and nutrients within the rumen is optimal so that we capture microbial growth, microbial protein, rumen digestion synchrony, and the energetic value of the feedstuff within the rumen as opposed to the small intestine. Here's an example of a new crop corn silage or recently harvested relative to a longer-term fermented forage where the starch digestibility has improved through proteolysis, largely leaning on the work of Professor Pat Hoffman and others that have identified proline protein breakdowns and things through fermentation. But you can see this difference in rumen starch digestibility could account for as much as 10 pounds difference in performance per cow. So this is an area we're learning more and more about from a laboratory and from a nutrition field. But I wanted to point this out here again. This is the range in rumen starch digestibility that we see through Rock River Laboratory. So one brief slide and commenting on what can we do to improving upon challenge forage, recognizing that 2013 in some areas may not have been the feed quality and forage quality we're looking for. If our fiber digestibility has opportunity to be better in the diet, some areas to consider from a nutritional standpoint would be to replace some of that indigestible forage fiber, forage NDF, with possibly some more ruminally digestible feedstuffs, more fiber digestible feedstuffs such as corn gluten feed, soy hulls, wheat mids, cotton feed, some other things along those lines. Again, these are a few examples. There are others available in different markets, but what can we do to bring more digestible fiber into the diet and supplement around some of the poor fiber digestibility of the forages, potentially reduce the forage level in the diet. From a starch standpoint, if we're looking to optimize and improve ruminal starch digestibility, we're looking to be 60 to 80% ruminal starch digestibility as opposed to 30 to 50% ruminal starch digestibility. Ensure the kernel processing scores are greater than 70%. Again, optimize kernel processors at the time of harvest, check, and ensure that we continue to be in that 70+% processing score. Every kernel is not only broken but obliterated. Ensure the feedstuffs have a little bit longer time to ferment. Again, starch digestibility improves through fermentation. If we're feeding dry or other sorts of grains, consider a finer grind size if starch digestibility is not where we'd like it to be and we think we have opportunities. Ruminal digestibility is largely a function of effective particle sizes, again, outlined by Professor Hoffman. So if our grain is not being digested as well as we'd like, we can grind it to a finer particle size and hopefully improve digestibility from there. Consider premium steam flake corn or sugar, some other things along those lines. And then I do want to mention ash content yet again. As we consider what's bringing higher ash levels into our feed, whether it be field management or other factors, consider what impact that ash content is having on the nutritional quality of the feed, to the point that there may even be some anti-nutritional factors coming in with our ash and being part of our feed that we then are preserving and feeding later. So then moving on from what we've seen through the laboratory at the point of harvest, and now talking about and expanding upon preserving this high-quality feed stuff, I'll spend a little bit of time discussing what happens through fermentation. Again, when we preserve our feed stuff, we're using a fermentation process, epiphytic or natural bacteria out in the field, or inoculants. They're going to consume some sugar, and they're going to produce stabilizing fermentation acids and decrease the pH, in a sense pickling our feed so that we can preserve for long periods of time, 5 months, a year, 12 months, 18 months, many years, potentially. And the decrease in pH is largely what stabilizes this feed. I'm going to mention keeping oxygen out at all costs. That's essential for fermentation bacteria. Oxygen is very challenging to both stabilizing feed and then maintaining stable feed over time. I've got several charts following that will describe changes in feedstuff through fermentation. So what you can see here on the y-axis is either going to be pH or nutrients expressed as a percentage of dry matter, and then what happens after we harvest our feed and silo it within the silo. You can see within the first week of fermentation here, under a controlled situation, potentially an ideal, in the yellow you can see water-soluble carbohydrate. So this is the fuel for fermenting bacteria to grow, to produce lactic acid, as Dr. Bryan mentioned before, which is a primary driver of decreases in pH. So water-soluble carbohydrates are fermented, are utilized by fermentation bacteria, which produce lactic acid, which then decreases the pH in the feedstuff to a stable point of less than 4 for pH. So you can see as water-soluble carbohydrates are consumed from the tune of 10% down to 5 to 6% in this example, lactic acid is produced from 0 up to the point of about 3 to 4% in this final example, and you can see the pH decreases from a neutral pH of 7 in blue to a pH of about 3.5 where the feedstuff then remains stable. You can see I also have acetic acid listed on this plot, and acetic acid is produced to some extent, but is at a fairly reasonable level, less than 1%. Again, the factor we're looking at to drive the pH lower in feedstuff and in the most efficient manner possible is lactic acid. However, things can go awry if our chop length is incorrect, if our moisture is not quite where it needs to be, if our packing is not quite right, if it takes us multiple days or weeks to store and pack our feedstuff. We can have situations where the feedstuff and fermentation is not efficient, is not opportune, and we have situations where temperatures increase, other bacteria, other fermentation pathways start taking hold, and in this situation, in this example, it might be August of 2014 this year. We harvest our feedstuff. It's roughly 65 degrees outside under an ideal fermentation. We pack, we store the feed, we eliminate oxygen, and the temperature does increase somewhat through fermentation, but only a relatively low amount, 5-10 degrees maybe increase in fermentation temperature. However, in situations where oxygen isn't excluded or we don't do a good job of sealing the silo or ensuring proper conditions, you can see temperatures will increase to the tune of 15, 20, 25, or even 30 or 40 degrees, even to the point where we start damaging proteins and other nutrients within the feedstuff. These temperatures increase because, again, there are alternative pathways, alternative bacteria that come in and begin to utilize and consume carbohydrates. As carbohydrates, the water-soluble carbohydrates in this case, are consumed, some heat is produced. As you remember with the slide of one or two back, water-soluble carbohydrates were utilized to create lactic acid and drive the pH down. But under this scenario I'm now showing in this slide, we have opportunities to do better here. You can see that we either did not seal the silo correctly or something went wrong where we just are not getting the fermentation done as efficiently as we could have. You can see water-soluble carbohydrate content, again listed in the orange sloping line, is decreasing. If you remember back, it stabilized somewhere between 5 and 6%. Again, that was sugar that was still available in the feed, available to the cows. But you can see in this point, it's continually being metabolized and utilized by bacteria. The reason the bacteria are still using and utilizing the water-soluble carbohydrate is because we did not produce enough lactic acid, we didn't drive pH down fast enough, and other things like yeast and mold and non-fermenting bacteria are coming in and continuing to consume sugars. They were creating the heat on the chart I showed you before, in some cases where the temperature might be 25, 30, or 40 degrees, even warmer than what it was when we put up the feed, even to the point where we might be burning some some protein. And you can see even after a month, this fermentation doesn't look like it was stable yet. We don't know where the end point is going to be. Again, we have quite a bit of opportunity to conserve additional dry matter in this situation to the tune of maybe 10, 15, 20% more feedstuff than were harvested off the field. So the next couple slides, I'm going to show you some guidelines that I've worked with several others and some published literature to put together. But what I want to draw your attention to on these slides is that as the fermentation analysis goals, as we talk about the end point of fermentation in pH and lactic acid and the other fermentation compounds, I want to draw your attention to how many samples that come through Rock River Laboratory actually meet our goals, meet our guidelines. So at the end of the fermentation process and later in the year, we see many samples actually that achieve a fairly reasonable level of lactic acid. The pH of the feedstuff eventually decreases to a point where the feedstuff is stable. Again, that's driven by lactic acid. So we have 82, 83% of corn silages reaching the lactic acid level that we consider ideal, and we have 70% of legumes or grasses reaching the lactic acid level, again, meaning pH in the feed eventually becomes stable. However, you can see acetic acid, and again, under this scenario, acetic acid is produced when the fermentation doesn't quite go in the most efficient path possible. And some other bacteria, again, not the ones that are doing the most efficient job possible in creating lactic acid, are creating acetic acid and, again, consuming additional water-soluble carbohydrates. So we like to see the acetic acid levels less than 2%, less than 1.5% for corn silages and legumes and grasses, respectively. So you can see we have opportunities here to more efficiently ferment quite a few crops. Less than 50% of the crops that come through Rock River Laboratory have acetic acid levels below 2%. Less than 65% of samples that come through the Rock River Lab doors for legumes and grasses have acetic acid levels less than 1.5%. So again, quite a bit of opportunity there to ferment feeds in a bit more efficient process. From a high moisture corn sample, similar story. Again, approximately 50% of samples meeting our goals. So again, wrapping up in the next few minutes, what can we do to capture that additional forage quality, that additional water-soluble sugar content that might be utilized or fermented, and that dry matter loss, again, capturing more utilizable energy for high-performing cattle. We need to exclude oxygen. There are many factors we can consider, but in the pie chart down at the bottom you can see your feedstuff is a combination of not only dry matter and silage, but also water, which excludes air, and then the air component that comes in. And again, the mold, the yeast, the anti-nutritional microbes, they need oxygen to thrive. And what can we do to eliminate oxygen? One factor to consider is silage density. So this is something that's been discussed quite often over the last 5-10 years, and I think the industry has done a fairly good job in improving the density or the packing of forages, both in bags and in silos and in drive-over pits and piles. I adapted some data from a publication by Ruppel et al., where actually the authors found a significant relationship between silage dry matter density and silage losses. So in this scenario, I've actually plotted out again a corn silage that was harvested, again with fuel costs, seed costs, harvest costs being built into the equation, roughly $46 a ton. And if we do a good job packing that feed stuff and manage for that minimum 7.5% dry matter loss, again you can see that we're carrying over that cost to about $46 per ton to preserve that in the bunker. However, if we have poor efficiency in fermentation, if we don't do a good job in packing in this case, and our dry matter losses are actually much higher, they're not 7.5%, but they're actually over 20%, you can see the increase that actually has in the resulting paid for cost per ton of feed that we bring then to the feed bunk and feed our cattle. Again, quite a big difference here to the tune of 25% difference in resulting feed costs. So in discussing limiting dry matter loss, preserving as much water-soluble carbohydrate, sugar, and valuable nutrients that we can, here are some points to consider. Harvest your high-quality crops. Again, higher sugar contents, promoting an aggressive fermentation, and avoid grain and rained-on crops. Again, with the sugar content being washed out through rain, or lower quality crops not having the sugar content in the first place, it's going to be more difficult to ferment and preserve those feeds. Dr. Bryan showed a graph earlier focusing on moisture, and it relates to dry matter loss. I just want to reiterate that. Chopping at the correct moisture with corn silages or haylages, again, on the drier side, we're going to end up with higher dry matter losses. I'd advise to put your decision maker on your pack tractor or at the silo or at the bagger. As the crop comes in, variability from one field to the next, or even within a field, or speed with which the crop comes into the silo structure. Have that person be in a position where they can make some critical decisions and advise the rest of the team what they're seeing. Is the moisture correct? Are we able to pack things correctly? Beyond the crop and at the chopper, I'd advise using a research-proven inoculant. Again, I stress research-proven because there are quite a few products on the market, but a lot of potential to improve fermentation, again, given the research behind. I'd like to advise that you consider insulating the mixing tank, mix the product at the correct ratios. Working in the field, I've seen quite a few examples, and I know Dr. Kung out of University of Delaware has actually recognized that in many cases the correct ratios and the temperature actually of the water can kill inoculant bacteria, again, very valuable bacteria to efficiently preserving feedstuffs, but the temperature of the water raises to a point where they're not viable. And I also want to advise keeping a fresh supply because there is a shelf life to these bacteria once they're mixed with water. Then after the packing is completed, covering with plastic, very important to not only keep rain and sun off of the crop, but also eliminate oxygen. So consider an oxygen barrier plastic, again, research backed, but anything we can do to keep oxygen out of the crop and keep birds and other vermin from poking holes and allowing oxygen to come through. And then cover the plastic layers with tires or weights or some sort of tie down to keep that plastic adhered to the pile. Again, anything we can do to keep wind or oxygen or air from slipping up underneath that plastic. So in summarization, from my section here in my time, I see us having substantial opportunity to improve forage quality, both in what we harvest off of the field and also what we preserve then through fermentation and feed out to our cattle. To the tune of, I think there are 5 to 10 pounds of milk per cow per day on the table through putting up higher quality feeds in the field and then carrying those through to feeding. I'll encourage all of you to look at your fermentation losses. I've heard some accounts of near zero dry matter losses from weighing feeds across the scale and attempting to take accurate moisture measurements, but I know that's physically not possible because, again, fermentation consumes sugars to create lactic acid and lower the pH. And I can tell you under research situations, even with some very well-controlled studies, the minimum dry matter loss we could expect might be 2.5%, 3.5%. So I want to, again, do what we can to efficiently ferment feed the lowest cost feed we can to our cattle, as opposed to leaving either sugar or starch or other highly valuable nutrients on the table that are lost through fermentation. In wrapping up, I'll offer my contact information for follow-up here. Again, I appreciate being brought into the discussion and the fold today and contribute. And then references as well that I've referenced here today in support of both the guidelines and some of the information I presented. And I can offer those again to anybody by request. But then I'd like to pass back over to Dr. Bryan to carry us through the finish line.
Thank you, Dr. Gazer. Again, a lot of information covered in a relatively short amount of time. Coming back to the dairy sustainability cycle, I think it's really important to realize that we're looking at winter cover forage crops as a significant source of nutrients to feed the dairy cattle, but we have the same challenges in terms of getting those nutrients out of the field to the feed bunk and potentially improving digestibility through the cow, but focusing on probably the first and foremost critical control point, harvest and storage. We touched on the physical, chemical, and environmental control points that we can potentially influence in order to maximize dry matter retention and recovery and potentially improving nutritional feeding values of those crops that we feed to cows. Lastly, again, a reminder that in terms of sustainability, all of the animal performance, animal health, welfare, environment, and food safety concerns are not to be taken lightly, but certainly the discussion is not complete without some attention or focus being paid to profitability, as it significantly affects sustainability as we look to the ultimate end product, milk from high-producing dairy cows. With that, I'll draw your attention to the Christian Hansen Animal Health and Nutrition Consultants, or your microbial technology specialists. We've touched on highly researched and effective inoculants, but we also offer a direct-fed microbial or probiotic component. We provide documented and cost-effective microbial solutions because of our core competencies in selection, development, fermentation, and distribution of those beneficial microbes. And specifically, our nutrient scorecard provides dairy producers, influencers, and consultants the means to objectively quantify improvements in sustainable practices that consistently yield favorable returns on investment. And I'm a fan of Henry Ford, and he said that coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is success. And we certainly appreciate your time and the opportunity to share our messages with you today. Thank you once again, at which point I think we'll be ready to entertain some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Gazer and Dr. Bryan. We've had an interesting discussion, and especially in light of the importance of forages in today's dairy rations. I see we have a little time for questions. As a reminder, if you have any questions, type them into the dialog box on your screen. We already have some questions coming in. This one's for you, Dr. Bryan. You outlined a number of different benefits of using inoculants, such as inhibiting yeast and molds, reduction of Clostridia, and preservation of nutrients. On today's webinar, we have participants from throughout the country. Are there specific challenges related to geography or climate or weather?
There are. I think that more often than not, we tend to see a little bit more detrimental effect of heat and lack of humidity in the west and southwest, and oftentimes we see a little bit more effect of cool and wet in the upper Midwest and Northeast. So selection of the proper inoculant depends not only on the crop characteristics, whether it's at one end of the spectrum or the other relative to moisture, whether it's at one end of the spectrum or the other relative to soluble carbohydrate versus protein, but also in terms of the climate or the environment in which we'll be making and harvesting and preserving various forages throughout the country or the world for that matter.
Okay. Dr. Gazer, this question might open up a whole can of worms and might be worth a whole webinar on its own, but one of the hottest topics this winter at dairy nutrition meetings has been shredlage. Have you had any opportunity to analyze shredlage based on NDF and TT-NDF?
Great question. So shredlage has potential to, in my opinion, put a more healthy or effective rumen mat together for high-performing cattle, but I have not seen much of an impact in some of our laboratory measurements of fiber digestibility, again, being removed from the animal, some in vitro digestibilities, and then TT-NDFD. No, we have not seen an improvement in fiber digestibility through those in vitro measurements. I speculate again that shredlage providing more effective fiber to the rumen and improving fiber digestibility potentially through a cow level impact as opposed to impacting the fiber. But again, at this point, that's purely speculation on my behalf.
Well, unfortunately, that's about all the time we have for questions today. If we didn't get to your question, you will receive an email response following the webinar. And if you have additional questions, you can also submit them via email following this webinar. Our thanks to Dr. Keith Bryan and Dr. John Gazer, and thanks to Christian Hansen Incorporated for sponsoring this dairy herd management webinar on high-quality fermented forage, investigating critical control points. If you'd like to review today's webinar or share it with another member of your dairy's management team, it will be available for on-demand viewing within 48 hours at www.dairyherd.com/webinars. I'm Dave Natsky, editor of Dairy Herd Management, and I look forward to having you back here soon for another Dairy Herd Management webinar. Thank you.